Thank you, Raid, and I thank once again Margaret and our newest and boldest team member, Pamela Agpar. And I always enjoy meeting with the BCS constituents. And this is, as you said, a bit of a sad occasion for us because normally not very far away is the voice and the input and the value of Barclay Brown, but not today. I'll mention him a couple of times in this presentation because that was the way it was. We're going to talk about leveraging human intelligence. And the object of leveraging the human intelligence is to produce reliable quality systems. And the phrase, we coined the phrase intelligent systems, was with Barclay and I sitting around having dinner at an International Council of Systems Engineering evening breakout where we could go out and just sit and have fun and talk. And when I met with him on those, we talked serious things and projects, and he was always working through some theory or some new idea, and as I often was. And I'll point it out as we go through, but intelligent systems is a really, really important concept. And it kind of grew out of the discussion that is part of our training on vocational certainty. The result was Barclay wrote a book called Engineering Intelligent Systems. I recommend you, if you can, get a copy of it. It's a pretty heavy read, but for somebody in IT or in the systems engineering or hard engineering world, you'll love it. So we'll move on here. Let me just clear my voice. All of engineering and all of IT work, everything we do in a business that requires communications or the documentation of processes or transactions is based on, the promise to one another to do certain things. And the culture that we live in and work in delivers what the customer wants, needs, and or expects. That's the objective, is that we discuss what we want, what we need, what we expect from a product or service, and someone makes a bargain with us through advertising or direct contact or in some other way to fulfill that promise, that need, that want, that expectation that we have. And oftentimes how well we describe that and how well we describe how we're going to fulfill it are very important parts of being a satisfied customer. We share our expectations also of whether or not the product makes us feel safe and secure. And safe and secure, the terminology has been broadly widened in recent years. I never felt insecure or unsafe if somebody said a bad word to me or threatened me in the sense of business retaliation or competition or something like that. But now most people consider those threats. And I spent 8 or 9 years in Russia, going there 36 times. And I remember thinking the people that I dealt with in the business sense all the time were constantly threatening me and saying things to me that would maybe terrify some people and maybe make them feel uncomfortable. And I noted that the difference was they meant it, and that the cultures that I'd come from, they didn't. Well, just think that way about the product or service that we send as an IT or systems engineering professional. Does it make the person who's going to use those products feel safe and secure or not? Especially our IT products, our feeling of safety, and we're wondering about who can hack into our system or who can sabotage this or that. And you think about it, how much time we spend on the side of security and safety and making sure our product works the way it should, and it can't be turned against an individual. It's a very important concept. And also trust and reliability sort of runs along the same lines. So we don't buy a product that the kinds of things that we do in this world of IT and systems engineering. We make products that get into people's lives and get close to people and their products and their systems in a way that they like to feel and should feel safe and secure and feel the reliability of our promises. And these promises are delivered on most cases by average people. Those of us that have professional certifications and advanced degrees may be slightly above average, but on most things, we're just average people. I can remember the day of the Apollo 11 launch, and I was, as Wright said, a junior engineer. I was an associate research engineer serving the 12 people that were finally responsible for calling the ball and pre-test and launch of the spacecraft. And so I was there all the time listening to what they were saying and doing. I wasn't making decisions. I was their gopher. I was their grunt, as they called it, like in the military. I was the facilitator, the expediter to get data for them. But I realized on that day of the launch that it was all done by most of us being pretty average people. We weren't particularly brilliant. The 12 guys were particularly brilliant. There were managers and particular engineers that were great. But what we had, excuse me, let me clear my voice so that you're not bothered by this over and over. What we had was a feeling of camaraderie, and that was good. But what was most important was a unification of purpose. We shared a common process ethic, how we were going to hold each other accountable. We wouldn't have nonverbal, we wouldn't have verbal communications instead of written communications whenever possible. All kinds of things like that that made our process and our relationships very stable. We did things in a very complex system in a very systematic way. We had lots and lots of manuals and checklists and what have you. And my very first job with this team was to accumulate the launch requirements. And so every subsystem had a set of requirements that had to be conformed in not perfection, but 100% alignment, which is different, before we would give a launch go. And so I understood systematic, and I had to differentiate between systematic and systemic. We'll get to that. But I don't think there's ever been a more systematic environment than the Apollo program. But since then, a lot of technologies have replaced and verified and validated in some ways more efficient and sometimes more accurate ways of doing things. But we can't always depend on the systematic approach to our work. There has to be more. We have to verify inputs and validate outputs, and we have to do it with rigor and due diligence. Barclay and I used to have a lot of talks about this because rigor and due diligence don't necessarily produce good outputs. They do if they're following a system of thinking and documentation and so on. If we're systematic about it, it does help. And so we always fall back into this gray area of how much determinant influence should a human being be in this process versus a technology, which is a major topic of discussion now with AI, generative AI, and these kinds of things available to us. But we had to go also to the area and be competent and confident of our systemic collaboration, basically our networking communications, because we had people all around the world that needed to know what we were doing. They had a reasonable expectation that if we did things properly, they were safer, they were more secure in their work and their ability to deliver a product. And they were able to project to the various constituencies that supported them financially, governments and businesses and so on and so forth, where they're buying and selling, that they were interacting with a stable system. And so we had to go beyond the rigor and the due diligence and verifying the inputs and verifying and validating the outputs to assuring connectivity. And those of you that have gone through the training before, you know that the assurance of things is that we put good things into the process. So we had to have excellent connectivities, everything from the computers we use to communicate active launch data or process data that was taking place from time to time. Back then it was PCM telemetry. And these were important steps that were layers of reliability. As things got more and more complicated and larger, and there have been all kinds of super systems since then, people came along with various technologies that were designed to deliver at high levels in a complex system. And often it had the inherent, if not specific, promise that you don't need as many people and it'll do better than people. And as I said before, sometimes that was true. There are technologies that would do that. But the problem that we began to see was the emphasis became time to market or time to launch, time to negotiate. There are different milestones in the development process. And so we began to be driven by the fulfillment of a time mark. And then there came along things like metrics have always been there, but KPIs started. Before the 21st century, you rarely heard the term KPI, but a key performance indicator or index, depending on how you're applying it, is the same as a metric. But it's purposeful. It says, I need to know this particular thing because I'm using it to drive decisions that are very, very important to me. The concern about certainty, we heard more about that. As when I coined the phrase vocational certainty, it was differentiating between the certainty of an electronic or digital or mechanical, some kind of a system, and the human person. And of course, the famous V here from engineering. So we had these technologies making wonderful promises to us about improving our delivery and either reducing the costs of or the need for average people. The problem is we all have stories or can quickly find them of under delivery. These promises were undelivered by failure to properly apply the metrics and the knowledge that we were getting from our systems. In other words, the technologies were outracing and outmaneuvering the human element. And we started to not focus so much on the human element and focus more on those that were providing technologies and designing and develop responses from them. And so there was a sort of a psychological and group effect, and that was industries began to race past the facts to get to an outcome because they were, first of all, so totally focused on time to market metrics, all that kind of thing. And certainty is a sort of a synonym for quality. And we can talk about that for hours, that they lost their focus on the importance of reliable human beings. I was speaking at a conference back in 2000, it was early, maybe it was 2015 or 16. And there was a big emphasis on agile development. And I've come to really appreciate it. The 12 organizing principles of agile development are nearly identical if we had 12 organizing principles for quality management, for the QA and QC being used together to manage the quality of products and services in their output. So when I heard about this fascinating new technology, or I should say methodology that was documented in a systematic way, I was intrigued because they said it was nearly 4 times as effective as what they considered the antiquated waterfall method. So, waterfall, you define something, you work through the process, you get to the end, you compare it, you can do it over again if you have to. I thought 4 times better. I don't know how you can get 4 times better because I've never worked on a project that you could multiply 4 times and get 100 or less. It would be 100 or more. So there was something about that statistic that didn't make sense to me. And then I ran across this interesting report by the Standish Group, and it's called the Chaos Manifesto. I stopped tracking it a few years ago. I don't think there, but it was 50,000 inputs from various companies that included projects that were from small. You can see here in the chart, small or large projects and anything in between, but they tried to categorize them. And the first thing I found was that the 39% that they were talking about, which I thought, well, they said 4 times, turned out to be 39% success rate on all sizes, 18% on large, and 58% on agile. On the small. And so 4 times 11 is about 40%, 44%. So 39% and 11%, all of a sudden I said, wait a minute, you've lost your perspective. I can't think of a circumstance that if I walked into the engineering office or the IT data management office in any of the jobs I've ever had, starting with the one on Apollo, and said, I got this great idea how to manage this process that we're going to put 3 astronauts in a spacecraft and go up, or we're going to provide this thing for hospitals or for aerospace or for the retail delivery of products. And it works. This process of developing works 39% of the time to get it on time and as described and on budget. Aren't you excited? No, no one would have been excited. In fact, if I'd have ever said something like that on my first job in the engineering world, I'd have been blackballed back then. I'd have been X'd out. I'd have been said, this guy's got strange ideas about reliability. So you can see that even at all sizes, it's only 39%. That's mixing in the others. Here, 18% is 6 times better. Ooh, that sounds great, except it's only 18%. So these numbers were very misleading, but they expose something very important. The ridiculous shift to technologies and methodologies that provided promises that were determinate by human beings. Whether or not these outcomes could be raised had nothing at all to do with the agile technology or methodology or approach. It's fine. And it didn't occur to people right off the bat that it was because they were dealing with a less than competent, less than ethical, less than efficient human workforce. And the data points to culture and process. It doesn't point to technologies failing because they weren't failing. So along comes AI, quantum, all the other advanced analytics, all kinds of rapid, detailed guidance that we can get. And the first person I heard to say it publicly or knew about it was Ginny Rometty over at IBM. And Ginny was the CEO of IBM. And of course, they were a leader at the time and have stayed as a leader in large mainframes and in quantum rapid development AI. So they had major investments in these things. And I had the privilege, because of a couple of the cohorts I ran, and that I regularly interacted with some of the leadership of those important programs. And you know what they all said, including her? These are technologies that are supposed to augment human intelligence every time. No one ever said it's supposed to replace human intelligence, because that's impossible. I've spent a lot of time with AI this last 2 years, a lot of it with our colleague Barclay Brown. And I had to learn how to prompt engineer more effectively. I realized that a lot of the search subjects and topics that I had used in the past in my language wasn't really precise enough. And now I'm talking to a computer that I have to keep reminding myself it's not a human, but I have to treat it like a human and speak to it like a human and add the specifics I would like a human, and then consider the digital side of it. It was very interesting because the next thing they want to do is apply this AI and the other things that I've just mentioned to provide robotics, not just in assembly lines for automobiles or those kinds of things. There's been a lot of robotic manufacturing out there for a long time, but to individual services in a home, for instance. And so now they're moving this forward, driving cars and so on and so forth, driverless cars. And these things are all working very well. If you look at the statistics, a driverless car is actually safer than a driver in his own car. I know that's hard to believe, but it statistically. But do you want to be the one? And this was from a specific test that was an unexpected outcome in a snow region, oddly, and most of us here in the United States are experiencing really bad snow. And the optics on the automobile that was driving around misread a traffic sign mileage requirement and thought instead of 35, it said 85 miles per hour. Well, that was an exciting experience. And those kinds of things had to be adjusted in the optics, the analysis of the optics, and so on and so forth. Because, and I said this in a meeting with some of these people, I said, I know what's going to drive innovation and advancements in these systems. And they said, what? I said, deaths and morbidities. When the deaths and morbidities start to get equal to or higher than those by drivered in automobiles and stuff, you will have to compete or you'll be out of business. Everyone in their subconscious, if not their conscious thoughts and fearful thoughts above that, understands that the human element is really, really hard to replace. No, it's impossible to replace because, and my friend, my agent, ChatGPT and others have, and if you put them under the right interrogation, they'll tell you interesting things. Hey, I'm just a machine. I haven't seen that yet. Oh, I'm sorry that I gave you that answer. I really overgeneralized from a very short pattern that I thought I had discovered. These are actual specific feedbacks that I've gotten from the machine. And it can apologize and deflect and fake compliance because it's designed to help you and to want to please you using Barclay's language. And if you forget the fact that that's what it's doing, and if you don't hold it accountable with your own domain knowledge, if you don't have the proper domain knowledge and vocational certainty regarding the topics you're working on, it can tell you things that sound very, very, very accurate, and they are not. And it's because it hadn't picked up that piece of data yet. It didn't integrate it. But when it said to me one day, I'm sorry, I picked up a short pattern and generalized it inappropriately to your request, I stopped it and I said, stop, listen to me. Now, I know it's not a person, but I write, listen to me. You're wasting my time. You're supposed to be saving my time. I don't want you jumping steps in process ethics. Now, I can tell it that, but I don't know if it actually adjusts to that. Whereas if I tell a person that, and I'm there to observe and to hold them accountable, I have a higher reliability, even though the machine is supposed to be without sentient, without emotion, without concern about that thing. So I'm not sure if I want a psychopathic machine that isn't driven by empathy, or I want somebody that if there's psychopathy in their life, it's obvious and maybe I can work on it or work around it. These are questions that Jenny Romity and others were asking way back in 2010 or 15 because they were anticipating these problems coming their way. So I want to talk about some of the vulnerabilities in systems management and quality particular that we have to deal with. The first is competency. And the second is ethics. And the third is accountability. They're kind of combined. The first is the state of the American workplace. This is the Gallup poll. I've been reading this study for 8 or 10 years. I think the first time I ever read it was 2016. The statistics that I'm going to share with you have varied plus or minus 1 or 2 or 3% every year. Mostly it's steady around the numbers that I'm going to present to you. So they haven't changed a lot. And they've actually broken them out now by profession, by region, by actual states, by age groups. And it's very interesting to me because I expected there be more variation in these different measures, but there's not. And so they found out that 70% of the people that they interviewed, which again was a large, very large, I think it was 30,000 respondents, whereas the Standish report was 50,000 respondents. That's a good number for a survey. Said they either hated or they were either disengaged, actively disengaged, or hated their jobs. You think about it. What kind of work is a person going to do if they're disengaged? It's okay. I like it here. Actively disengaged. This place is a mess. Or hate their jobs. I don't like what I do, and I don't like where I work. What's that going to do to the quote unquote motivations, the focus, the reliability of the human being? Not only that, the 30 or so percent, and it went from 34 to 60, to 66. It would split back and forth like that, but around 30% of the people. They found out that the workload was being carried by 30 to 34% of the people. And what did it do to them? It discouraged them. It caused them to be less trusting of the systems that they were getting information from. It caused them to be less trusting of the management to correct these problems or to deal with the human elements. And they became discouraged and they started to move from place to place and migrate within their company and within their industry and so on and so forth. So, along with these error rates, and they were huge error rates, there was this instability in various industries. The American Institutes for Research, which is a very reliable, very liberal-minded a group of researchers, said this. Now, when I read this, now this is the same time period, I was so shocked because it said 50% of the people with four-year college degrees. Now, this is in various disciplines, including engineering, psychology, healthcare, all kinds of places where reliability is pretty important. 50% of the people that had four-year college degrees. Now, we're not talking about high school or first secondary or we're talking about graduate. I lost the audio. Right? Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear
Okay.
you. Yeah,
I'm
thank
Just
getting
you.
lost
warnings
you
on the
yeah,
sign here.
we just lost
Okay.
you for a second.
Okay, good. Thanks. So 50% of these people could not pass a fundamental literacy exam. And that literacy exam was this: you read a paragraph about a topic, and then you had to describe what the topic was about. So if it was about fixing a pie, baking a cake, whatever, you would say, oh, you were describing how to bake a cake. 50% with people with four-year college degrees could not do that. The same, the other test on the math test, which was part of the certification they went through, was that if you gave them a menu and said, read the menu and pick out two items, like a hamburger and a salad or something like that, and add them up in your mind and tell me what the answer is, 50% couldn't add 12 and 7 and get 19. Well, do you know what the lack of math skills does to logic and to the kinds of interpretation of and analysis of data? It does horrible things to it. And the lack of the ability to communicate in written form and understand what is being said, either to write it or to read it, is another major problem within the working community. So there are a lot of other statistics like this. And if you go on our website at the Quality Management Institute, you'll see several insights into various parts of human nature, human expression, and human behavior that often reach 60 or 70% failure rate. And they're human things that do affect the way we work and so on and so forth. So these are things that we've sort of ignored. And here's another indicator of the problem, and we call it the challenge of education. This is called the Bloom's taxonomy, and it's a hierarchy of what Learning should be for learning to be retained, expressed properly, and then to be improved, analyzed, improved, and innovated around any industry or product or service or whatever topic we're working on. First, you have to recognize and recall facts. You've got to read a book, you've got to take a lecture, you've got to do something. And then you are tested on that to prove that you've captured those facts and that you understand what they mean. So there has to be some sort of assessment or analysis or exam or something where you're tested in order to prove that you could do an oral exam. There are lots of ways, but you have to demonstrate that you have the facts that are pertinent to that industry. I had a young man, and I've told this before, some of you have heard this, who was a graduate of a major technical university in an engineering degree. I'll just say it's Georgia Tech. And we were in a meeting one day, and I said something like this: well, how many of you had trouble with transistor theory? Was that hard for you the first time? Because for some people, it was very easy and obvious. For me, it wasn't particularly, but I managed to get it and get a really good grade on the little exam that I had to take. And this young man raised his hand with a 4-year college degree from Georgia Tech in engineering, BSEE. He says, we don't use transistors anymore. And how many of you had a heartbeat stop there? We don't use transistors? I said, no, we use them in the trillions by trillions by trillions. Little chips that are running everything? Those are all little transistors in there. And he was dumbfounded, and the room gasped. And almost everyone in the room was older than him and had real engineering experience. And he was a novice with a degree from Georgia Tech. So those kinds of things have creeped in, and I'll tell you why. It's right here in Bloom's. As I started speaking to various academic leaders about quality management, they were very much intrigued by it and liked the promises that come with it. But they disagreed on my assessment method. They said, why are you bothering with all these lower levels of assessment, giving them exams and tests and stuff? We're more interested in the high end of assessment because we want to know how this affects their thinking. We're preparing people to go into the workplace and think and to innovate. And so we're really concerned about how the training affects those higher assessments of a human competence. And I said, well, here's the way it works. You get the facts, you get to apply the facts, you get to analyze them and work with them and gain experience and knowledge and insights. And pretty soon you're evaluating those facts and learning how to reduce errors or increase time to market or decrease time to market or those kind of things. And the next thing you do, you're probably out there creating a new product and getting a patent and moving that whole thing forward. And I think that's a wonderful process. But I'm telling you, if you haven't gone through the process of learning like that, I don't care how you feel about it. I could care less what your idea is until you've gone through those steps, because you will have missed so much that the reliability of your input is extremely questionable. There's no doubt in all, because I teach a course at King's College, London, every fall on risk-based quality management to public health officials and what have you. And I asked 3 questions during the presentation. That's one of these poll things. Usually somewhere between a third to a half of the people have never gone through a public educational system that conforms to Bloom's. They all say they jump right to a discussion about feelings, input, perceptions, and so on, without having the experience to have any weight on that. So imagine how these things are starting to affect output. Then there's the lack of emphasis on systems thinking, or the wider view of what systems really are. So we talked about Barclay Brown a couple of times. My very first discussion with Barclay at a systems engineering session was at a systems engineering, systems thinking, a breakout session at a conference. And we afterwards said, what'd you think of that? And I said, I didn't get a lot out of it. I just didn't think it was very well organized. I don't know. I didn't like the presenter very much either. and it was a chair, not a presenter, but it was controlling the meeting and stuff. And he says to me, "You want to know why?" I said, "I'd love to know why. What is it?" He said, "Because they don't understand systems thinking. They really don't get it." I said, "Well, that's why the presentation was so bad. It wasn't even close, because systems thinking is an approach to problem solving that considers and evaluates facts and events as part of an overall system." And I'm in a room full of young engineers and some not so young. And guess what they were talking about? Feelings and perceptions. A little early to be talking about feelings and perceptions unless you understand feedback loops and how to interpret those feedback loops to in an agile setting or in a waterfall setting to improve the hypothesis about your work design and so on and so forth. Systems thinking is supposed to decrease the potential for solutions that fail and unintended consequences created by reacting to a specific part or outcomes or events in isolation. I call it looking through a straw. Systemic collaboration is required in all of these things. So we've got people to deal with. But systems thinkers view the world and its people as interactive parts of a system, people and technologies. So if you're imagining the world through a straw or imagining a system and viewing it through a straw, just imagine what you're missing. You're missing all kinds of intricacies and complexities and interactive and determinant factors of the system, say it with me, and its people. Uh, this is a problem that started to slowly grow like mold on the inside of a refrigerator. This is bad news. An effective quality system must be an intelligent system where the people are the determinant asset. Now, clearly, people are not as good as any system that I've seen so far at aggregating data and under the direction of specific requirements from a person, reducing that data to the usable format that you want and the usable depth that you want with enough granular and drill down in it that you want and ask for. And they can do it faster and more accurately than any human alive. We all know that. And the objective is to give the determining person, the determining factor, the data they need to act. Now, in some manufacturing systems, that's fine. If you're building widgets and the computer, the agency of the IA or whatever, AI, says, "Oh, it's this and so," you can give it permission to make the decision and adjust itself. And that works fine. It even works fine on certain larger systems. But most of the time, a reliable human being is the determinant factor for creating the requirements, explaining them to the system and all the people that support it, getting sure that the requirements are properly presented to the technologies, and evaluating that with process knowledge, with experience and vocational certainty before you turn it loose. The best argument I ever heard of was about the Kasparov effect. And this proves that an intelligent system is the pairing, and this was what Barclay and I were talking about at dinner one night. The pairing, the reasonable pairing of competent, well-prepared humans and the right technologies. And Kasparov was the world champion chess player. And IBM had a machine they called Big Blue, and they could play chess. And it would direct an amateur. I could sit down there and it could help me beat Kasparov. And so they got together, and there was a series in the game. I've got it generally right, but Kasparov beat the computer twice or three times. And the people at IBM said, "Oh, okay." So they took the moves that he had made and got them all organized and input into the machine and came back and beat him. And so he said, well, so what? I could do that. So he took their moves and his moves and input them into his machine and came back and stomped them. They couldn't beat him and their machine. You follow it? His machine and him were better than their machine and them, because the human was the determinant factor, and the usage of the technology in the machine was just a tool in their hand. And each time they went back and forth, it got to be that once in a while IBM would be, they did a lot of these, but they didn't publicize it. And it was to us confirming evidence of the superiority of the properly prepared, vocationally certain, determinate human being using and being paired with an equally prepared, equally usable system or technology as a tool, not as a determinant. As part of the determining factors, yes. As part of preparing the determining person to make better decisions, absolutely. So the people are the determining asset. And the determinants that they really need to be focusing on is the managing of the balance and the reliability of the technologies and the technologists, so that the technologies don't dominate the thinking about the technologists. The technologists have to be properly prepared and paired with the technologies. And the same about the work culture. I saw something somebody wrote, said, culture eats process for breakfast. And I said, boy, that's the truth. We've known that for a long, long time. The whole quality management movement started with the discovery, or not the discovery, but the definition of zero defects by my mentor, Phil Crosby, in 1961. And so it's been written about and written about and written about, but we added something to it. We call it the zero defects attitude. And nothing picks up an attitude better than a qualified manager who has the vocational certainty, who has the technology knowledge, and advancements have been part of his or her life. And they will affect the work culture and the ability to properly apply technologies. So this thing about culture has been around a while. And people like Bill Crosby and W. Edwards Deming came along, and all they did was codify principles of management and leadership and the nature of humans in workplace that had been around for centuries. And you've heard a lot of this, but Phil said quality is the result of a carefully crafted cultural environment. They're trained, they're disciplined, they respond well to solving problems quickly, and they can organize. He said it has to be, that kind of culture has to be the fabric of the organization, not part of the fabric. In other words, you can't delegate that kind of motivation to the quality control department over here who does audits and checkpoints and things. You have to have everyone sharing that ethic and that ethos. Excuse me. Then Deming said, in his 14 points, emphasized the need to create constancy of purpose for improving products and services, and that it should be supported by a vigorous program of education and self-improvement for everyone. He said, it's not mandatory you do this, because it's not mandatory that your company survive. I thought that was a fantastic statement. He said, it's not mandatory anywhere that you should be profitable. You want to be profitable. And if you do, you need to do this. I began to work with Nkosi back in 2016, 17. And now the work that we've done at the Quality Management Institute is part of the Systems Engineering Handbook worldwide. And that is, we're building upon the principles and the methodologies, the values that were described by Deming and Crosby, which, as I just said, were describing what had been around effective for centuries, but it hadn't been codified the way they did it and supported by statistics. And we've added what is called the 8 attributes of a quality manager or a quality culture. And it's right in their guidebook, and then we wrote about it in 2005. And what we're talking about is building up the engineering culture or the IT culture or the retail company's culture so that they can be properly supported by AI and the other forms of technologies that we've developed to improve and deliver the product that we have promised, and do it at a better price point and at a reasonable profit margin so that we can compete. As Dr. Deming said, it's not mandatory that we do that, but it's not mandatory that we be around. So these are the 8 attributes. We'll be providing you the PDF for a download. And the 2 that I want to emphasize, and one I've already mentioned, is the 0 defects attitude and the vocational certainty of the human being. These are the 2 pillars of quality management and the building of a quality management culture that's reliable. 0 defects attitude is a measure of our commitment to keep our promises and to initiate systems with the reliability goal of preventing even one defect from reaching our customers. And you'll see if you advance in this process to a scholarship, we're not talking about perfection. We're talking about pressing toward the target of perfection. 0 defects. Not being satisfied with even one defect from reaching a customer. So you have to put yourself in a position, what if you're the person that gets that defect and how does it affect your life? Plus, there's a whole lot of science about what's called acceptable quality levels, where you say, well, I'll be happy with 90%. Most of us would be 90 or 95 in certain situations. But when your goal is 5 or 10 or 15 defects out of 100, you get much more than that, and you get sloppy work culture. Then the other is vocational certainty. It's a measure of our faithfulness to our career agenda. Quality managers are disciplined about developing their skills and talents and acquiring earned confidence. Earned confidence. So the young man I was telling you about who said we don't use transistors really anymore, how much earned confidence do you think his colleagues would have about him? Because along with that gap of knowledge that was shocking, there had to be all kinds of inconsistencies, undereducated, gaps of knowledge. Who knows what it was doing to his work ethic? There could be all kinds of things in there. So he hadn't yet gained earned confidence from his colleagues nor from his customers. You can read the rest of them: process quality, administrative consistency, executive credibility, personal authenticity, ethical dependability, and the last one is the skill to create a KTP culture, one that keeps its promise to its customers, to its colleagues and coworkers. This is what it looks like. This is the graphic of a quality culture. You see people on the left, processes on the right, and that we're trying to get a reliable culture that does things the way it's supposed to do, not only in the mechanical sense or in the production sense, but in the human sense with organizational values, personal values, and professional values. But we want competent culture. We want humanly competent people that share the same values and that share values that we've agreed to. When you go to work for a company, you get to choose whether you're going to work there or not. You get to choose whether you like their values. Sometimes it's very difficult to disengage from values that you didn't realize you were going to have to suffer under, but you have to make a choice. So you can see that this whole process of quality management and the delivery of products or services to people is based on promises that we make to them and their perceptions of our ability to fulfill what they want or what they desire and what they need. And how we succeed or not in life is dependent on our ability to fulfill that. This is what an effective work culture does in a corporate environment. We get all these wonderful things: delighted customers, engaged, high-performing workers, agile and lean products, just like agile promises, less defects and rework, on schedule, on budget, lean human resources. It just naturally, you can do it with 8 or 9 instead of 10, but it's not going to do what the promise of full automation is and get it down to 6 or 5 and still maintain the same levels of effectiveness. Self-correcting culture. This is the great thing in a good quality management culture that is effectively growing. People deselect from the environment. You don't have to fire anybody or have major confrontations for the most part. They say, I'm going to move over to some other thing. they're generally not going to say, I don't want to be a part of delighted customers, blah, blah, blah. They don't say that. And it's a very unconfrontational environment in terms of HR process, but it's an extremely confrontational environment in terms of values. And if people hold the values that we've just described, then they will adhere to them. If they don't, they'll migrate. And one of the larger institutions that I was doing business with said to me, and said to other people, and said to me, said, well, if they don't agree with these values, what would they agree with? How could you work with someone on a regular basis and put your shoulder against theirs and against the next person and really go after doing it right if they don't believe in these things? And I said, I don't have an answer for that because I've never seen it work any other way. At the end of the day, just as we started, average people properly paired with the right tools and processes in an intelligent system can do great things. Hope you've enjoyed the presentation today.